CBS News has confirmed that hundreds of U.S. Special Forces are now in the Middle East as President Trump weighs next steps for.
And that message from the defense secretary comes as a new report from Axios says the U.S. is weighing sending special forces to seize Iran's nuclear stockpile. That scoop is from Mark Caputo.
Iran's most fortified base was never surrounded by an army. It was surrounded by a decision. For 46 minutes, a handful of U.S. Rangers sat inside a kill box so narrow that every road out was covered, every hill above them was mined, and every radio call they made could have triggered a war that no one in Washington wanted to admit had already begun. But the strange part is not that Delta Force went in. The strange part is who wanted them there. Because buried underneath the official language, regional instability, protecting American personnel, deterring escalation, was a darker question no one wanted asked out loud. Who tipped off the Americans? Why did Iran's commanders hesitate when they had the Rangers pinned? And what happened in the next 72 hours that made the Pentagon bury the operation under layers of silence? Watch this closely. Because the answer does not begin in Washington. It begins on a strip of desert where three borders almost touch, where the maps look clean from a distance, but on the ground, every road belongs to somebody with a rifle, a grudge, and a radio. The base sat east of the mountains, hidden behind ridgelines, blast walls, radar shadows, and a security ring built to survive airstrikes. To satellites, it looked like a logistics site. Warehouses, vehicle sheds, fuel tanks. Nothing dramatic. That was the point. Inside, according to U.S. intelligence briefings, were not just weapons. There were people, advisors, technicians, missile operators, men who did not wear the same uniforms but answered to the same chain of command. And one of them carried a laptop the Americans had been hunting for 6 months. That laptop was the real target. Not the base, not the missiles, not the flags painted on the wall. A laptop. Because wars do not always start with explosions. Sometimes they start with a spreadsheet, a payment ledger, a set of coordinates, and the name of a proxy commander nobody in the West has ever heard of. By the time the Rangers moved, the clock had already started. 72 hours. That was the window. After that, the device would be moved deeper inland, beyond helicopter range, beyond plausible denial, and beyond the kind of operation that can be hidden behind phrases like limited action. So the plan was built around speed. Delta Force would go in first, find the package, identify the personnel, and mark the inner compound. Army Rangers would form the outer ring, seal the escape routes, and hold long enough for extraction. Simple on a slide. Suicidal on the ground. Because the Americans were not surrounding an undefended outpost. They were surrounding a fortified Iranian-linked base built exactly for this nightmare. Anti-air positions on elevated ground. Thermal cameras covering dry riverbeds. Mortar teams already registered on the main access roads. Hardened bunkers dug into the rock. And one more problem. The base was not supposed to be fully staffed. But at 0217 local time, a drone feed showed unexpected heat signatures. Dozens of them. Then more. Then vehicle movement. By 0234, the count had doubled. Someone had warned them. Silence. That was the first sign the mission had been compromised. Not gunfire. Not an alarm. Silence. The base stopped moving like a sleeping facility and started moving like a trap. Lights went out in sectors that should have remained lit. Patrols vanished from visible roads. Vehicles were repositioned under camouflage netting. A communications mast went dark, then came back online using a different frequency pattern. To a civilian, that means nothing. To a special operations planner, it means the enemy is no longer reacting. They are waiting. At Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, the command room had a choice. Abort and lose the target forever. Continue and risk handing Tehran the propaganda victory of the decade. Captured American operators inside a fortified Iranian base. The order came anyway. Proceed. But not because Washington was reckless. Because the hidden player had already made the alternative worse. Remember that phrase, hidden player. It matters later. The Rangers crossed the first line before dawn. No headlights. No chatter. Just armored vehicles moving through the dark, spaced wide enough to survive indirect fire but close enough to close the ring. The numbers were brutal. Roughly 75 Americans on the ground. An estimated 300 hostile fighters in and around the base. 3 hardened exits. 2 dry river channels. 1 helicopter corridor. And no carrier strike group close enough to solve the problem quickly if everything collapsed. This is where the myth of American power usually gets people confused. Viewers imagine jets overhead, destroyers offshore, satellites watching every doorway, drones reading license plates from the sky. But geography is cruel. Mountains bend radar. Dust blinds sensors. Political borders limit flight paths. And the closer you get to Iran's sphere of control, the more every minute in the air becomes a diplomatic gamble. The Rangers were not backed by magic. They were backed by timing. And timing was already slipping. At 0309, the first contact came from the West Road. A pickup truck rolled out from behind a fuel berm, lights off, moving too slowly to be a patrol and too directly to be accidental. The Rangers let it come. 200 meters. 170. Then it stopped. For 9 seconds, nobody fired. That pause nearly changed the Middle East. Because inside that truck, according to the later accounts circulated among command staff, was not a suicide team. It was a spotter cell. Their job was to force the Americans to reveal positions, trigger the base alarm, and pull the inner Delta team into a firefight before they reached the server room. The Rangers destroyed the truck before it transmitted. But the base heard enough. At 0312, the night opened. Mortars, machine guns, signal flares. Then the sound every soldier hates because it means the enemy has prepared. Overlapping fire from positions that cannot all be seen at once. The Rangers had not walked into confusion. They had walked into architecture. Every defensive position had been chosen to funnel attackers toward exposed ground. Every wall created a blind angle. Every ditch was just deep enough to hide a man with a launcher. And yet the ring held. That is the part Tehran did not expect. The Rangers were not there to storm the base. They were there to become the wall. Inside that wall, Delta moved. 4 small teams. 12 minutes behind schedule. 1 interpreter. 1 signal specialist. 1 route through a maintenance cut that should not have existed on any American map. But it did. Which brings us back to the question. Who gave them the map? The obvious answer is a spy. That answer is too shallow. Spies steal secrets. This was different. This was a guided incision. The Americans knew which patrol camera had a 4-second lag. They knew which generator powered the southeast sensors. They knew which drainage culvert had been sealed from the outside but left open underneath because a contractor had cheated on concrete depth. That is not one spy. That is institutional rot. Somebody inside the network wanted this base exposed. Not destroyed. Exposed. There is a difference. At 0326, Delta reached the inner compound and found the first locked door already unlocked. That should have been good news. It was not. An unlocked door in a fortified site means one of 2 things. Your source helped you, or your enemy invited you. The team entered anyway. Room 1, empty. Room 2, communications rack smashed. Room 3, blood on the floor but no body. Room 4, server cabinet still warm. Then the first message came over the net. Package not present. 6 months of tracking. A cross-border operation. Rangers pinned outside under mortar fire. And the target laptop was gone. This is the moment most missions fail emotionally before they fail tactically. The men outside start bleeding for an objective that no longer exists. The men inside start rushing. Command starts demanding clarity from people who are standing in smoke, dust, and ricochets. But then the signal specialist saw something strange. The server racks were not destroyed randomly. They were destroyed selectively. Hard drives removed from 2 units. Power cables cut on 3. 1 terminal left running. On its screen, a transfer log. 38 minutes earlier, data had been copied to an external device. 38 minutes. Not hours. Not yesterday. 38 minutes. Which meant the target had not been moved deep inland. It was still nearby. Now the mission changed. The base was no longer the target. The convoy was. At 0339, a drone picked up 3 vehicles moving north through a service route that did not appear on civilian maps. 2 armored SUVs. 1 box truck. No lights. Heat signatures inside. But here was the catch. If the Americans pursued, the Rangers' ring would thin. If they stayed, the laptop would vanish. If they called in air power, the strike could kill Iranian personnel and turn a deniable raid into a regional crisis before sunrise. Washington had designed the operation to avoid a war. Now the only way to complete it was to gamble with one. This is where Delta Force made the most brutal decision of the mission. They did not ask the Rangers to break contact. They asked them to tighten the ring. Think about what that means. Men already under fire were told to move closer to the base, closer to the mortars, closer to the fortified positions, to create the illusion that the main assault was still happening. A deception inside a disaster. The Rangers became the distraction. Delta split off. At 0348, 2 teams moved north, using the base's own perimeter chaos as cover. Behind them, Rangers fought for intersections with names that never made headlines because naming them would admit where the fight happened. One squad held a dry wash for 21 minutes against repeated probes. Another disabled a technical with a shoulder-fired weapon at less than 150 meters. A medic treated 2 wounded behind an armored vehicle while rounds snapped through the dust above him. And at the center of it all, Command watched a blue icon chase 3 red ones across a map that suddenly felt too small for the consequences. Then Iran's commanders did something strange. They did not flood the route. They did not close the northern road. They did not scramble the heavier response force waiting 16 kilometers away. They hesitated. Why? This was Loop 2. Why did Iran stay silent when it had the Americans exactly where it wanted them? The easy answer is fear of escalation. Wrong. Iran has built an entire strategic doctrine around operating below the threshold of open war.
Harass, deny, bleed, delay.
Use proxies, use ambiguity, use time. They do not hesitate because they are afraid of pressure. They hesitate when pressure is useful. At 0356, the convoy stopped near an abandoned pumping station, not because it was trapped, because it was meeting someone. A fourth vehicle arrived from the east. No headlights, no markings. And for exactly 90 seconds, all 4 vehicles were stationary. This was the reveal the Pentagon never wanted on a map. The people moving the laptop were not simply fleeing the American raid. They were transferring custody. The device was about to pass from a military-linked cell to a deniable network, the kind that can disappear into cities, border crossings, fake charities, shipping firms, and diplomatic baggage. Once that transfer happened, the raid would become meaningless. Delta had less than 2 minutes. They hit the pumping station from 2 sides.
No speech, no warning.
Just violence at the speed of a decision already made. The first SUV was disabled before its driver could turn. The second tried to reverse into a ditch and rolled onto its side. The box truck's rear doors opened, and 2 armed men came out firing. One went down immediately. The other made it 6 steps. Inside the 4th vehicle, the courier tried to destroy the device.
Not with a hammer, not with fire.
With a deadman encryption key. A small module plugged into the laptop that could scramble the drive if the wrong biometric sequence was entered. The Delta operator did not have to understand the code. He only had to stop the hand.
And he did.
That is the kind of detail official summaries leave out because it sounds too physical, too ugly, too intimate. But wars at the highest level often turn on the smallest motion in the darkest place.
A hand reaching for a keyboard. A finger on a detonator.
A courier glancing at the wrong door. At 0403, the package was secured. Loop 1 had an answer. Who orchestrated this? Not a single spy.
A faction.
A rival power current inside the same Iranian-linked network that wanted the base compromised because the people using it had become too expensive, too exposed, or too independent. That is the part sharp viewers need to understand. In proxy warfare, loyalty has an expiration date. The moment a commander becomes a liability, his enemies do not always kill him themselves. Sometimes they give his coordinates to someone who will. But the mission was not over.
Now came the worst part, getting out.
The Rangers had tightened the ring so effectively that the base defenders believed the main American push was still coming from the south and west.
That bought Delta time. But deception has a shelf life.
By 0411, the defenders realized the northern convoy was gone. Then the fire shifted. Mortars walked outward.
Machine guns pivoted north.
A mobile anti-air team moved toward the helicopter corridor. And suddenly, the Americans were not surrounding the base anymore. The base was closing around them. At 0418, the first extraction bird took fire and waved off. That one sentence hides a nightmare. Because when a helicopter cannot land, everything becomes heavier.
The wounded become heavier.
The equipment becomes heavier. Every meter to the alternate pickup zone becomes a negotiation with death. The new landing zone was 2.7 kilometers away.
Across broken ground.
Under pursuit.
With wounded.
And carrying the one object that had justified the entire operation. The Rangers were ordered to peel back in stages. One element moved. One element fired. One element covered the gap.
Then repeat. Again. Again. Again.
This is not cinematic heroism.
It is math.
If one team moves too early, the line collapses. If one team stays too long, it gets cut off. At 0429, an Iranian-linked response unit reached the southern access road. Heavier weapons.
Better coordination. Fresh fighters.
The Americans had maybe 15 minutes before the retreat became a rout. And then Washington's silence finally made sense. For hours, senior officials had avoided public posture.
No threats. No press leaks. No dramatic warnings.
The silence was not weakness.
It was containment.
Because the United States was not trying to send a message to Iran. It was trying to prevent Iran from being forced to answer. That is Loop 2 closing. If Washington admitted the raid, Tehran would have to retaliate. If Tehran admitted the base, it would have to explain what was inside. Both sides needed the same lie.
Nothing happened.
But on the ground, something was very much happening. At 0437, the mobile anti-air team set up near a ridge overlooking the alternate landing zone. If it fired, extraction could fail. If American aircraft destroyed it loudly enough, escalation could break containment. So the Rangers did it the hard way. A small team pushed upslope under cover fire, moving through rock and dust toward a position that had every advantage except one. It was looking up, not down. At 0442, the ridge went quiet. The helicopters came in 5 minutes later. But the final aircraft had room for men, not pride.
Equipment was dumped.
Sensitive gear was smashed.
Ammunition redistributed. The wounded went first. The package stayed with the last Delta element until the final count. At 0451, the last bird lifted. Below it, the base was burning in small places, but not destroyed. That was deliberate. No cratered runway. No flattened compound. No spectacular explosion for television. Just missing data, dead couriers, confused commanders, and a fortress that had been penetrated without either country admitting the obvious. For the next 72 hours, the region held its breath. Militia channels went unusually quiet. Iranian state media blamed foreign-backed sabotage, but avoided naming American forces. U.S. officials issued statements about protecting personnel and maintaining readiness. Oil markets twitched, then stabilized. And behind closed doors, analysts opened the laptop. What they found was not a single smoking gun. It was worse.
A map of relationships,
Payment routes.
weapons transfers, safe houses, names of handlers who had never appeared in public intelligence assessments, and one timeline that pointed to a planned strike window less than 2 weeks away.
Not a symbolic attack. A coordinated one. Multiple launch points. Multiple proxies.
Designed to overwhelm missile defenses, hit regional bases, and force Washington into either underreacting or overreacting. That was the brutal truth of the mission. The Rangers were not sent because war had started. They were sent because someone believed war was being scheduled. And here is the full picture. The base was bait, sanctuary, and liability all at once. Iran-linked commanders used it because it was fortified. Rival insiders exposed it because it had become dangerous. Washington struck it because the data inside could prevent a larger attack. And Tehran stayed quiet because admitting the raid would expose the very network it claims it does not control. Everyone had a reason to lie.
Everyone.
That is why the story disappeared. Not because it was small. Because it was too connected. Because if the public saw the whole board, the base, the courier, the factional betrayal, the laptop, the 72-hour silence, they would realize how close modern war often comes without ever being announced.
No declaration. No televised address.
No carrier group steaming dramatically through the night. Just 75 men in the dark, a fortified base that was never supposed to be vulnerable, and a laptop that may have changed the next month of history.
But one question remains. The most dangerous one.
If a faction inside the network helped the Americans once, did it stop there? Or was the raid only the first move in a much larger purge? One that is still unfolding through assassinations, missing commanders, sabotaged shipments, and unexplained explosions across the region? Because the next mission will not begin when the shooting starts. It will begin when someone somewhere decides which secret is worth betraying.